My name is Jay Shamba. I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, here at GW, and I want to welcome you virtually to George Washington University and to Washington, D.C. We at IIEP are very pleased to be hosting this event on Did U.S. Politicians Expect the China Shock? As part of our series on China's economy and U.S.-China economic relations, and to once again be partnering with our co-sponsors, the Seeger Center for Asian Studies at GW and the GW Center for International Business Education and Research, or GW Cyber. For those of you who don't know us, IIEP is located at the Elliott School at GW and is a cross-school interdisciplinary research center at GW. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality multidisciplinary research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization, and we interpret that mandate pretty broadly. So we support research and policy work in areas such as international trade, international finance, international development, poverty studies, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. And we have for a very, very long time focused on China's economy and have a series on it ongoing this year once again. We've been fairly busy at IIEP lately. Next week alone, we'll have a Tuesday afternoon seminar on governing new voluntary carbon markets and a Wednesday morning conversation on India's economy in a post-COVID world. And so I encourage you to look at our events page for upcoming events and to register and come watch them, or for that matter, to look at our YouTube page and see previous events that you may have missed. I'd like to acknowledge the IIEP Executive Circle for their support and welcome any members who are in attendance or watching later. And now, most importantly, I'd like to step out of the way and turn things over to Maggie Chen, who has been organizing our year-long virtual China conference this year, and let her moderate today's events.
Great, thanks, Jay. Good morning, everyone, and good evening, everyone. So in the last 14 years, our annual conference series on US-China economic relations and China's economic development has successfully become a leading forum in Washington. The annual series has featured about 150 leading scholars and practitioners and attracted more than 2,200 participants from around the world. In the last year, as we have witnessed, tensions between the US and China resumed in trade, technology, and beyond. In the meantime, despite the tensions, trade flows between the two countries have continued at a robust pace. I'm sure many of us have been wondering how the two superpowers' economic relations will move forward, especially under the new administration, and how China's economic development may translate to influence abroad through ongoing and new initiatives. This year, we have put together another outstanding program to cover issues like the China shock or the expectation thereof, understanding the trends of US-China hostility, the internationalization of renminbi, and digital currency. In the fall, we will continue hosting events virtually and take advantage of the virtual format to feature speakers from overseas. In the spring, we aim to start hosting events in hybrid formats, and we'd love to welcome everyone back to campus. Now, before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to express our appreciation on behalf of IIEP for all the support we have received from our alumni who have helped make this event a great success. In particular, we would like to thank Mr. Ning Li, Mr. Frank Wang, and Mr. Dan Stramillo for their philanthropy and contributions throughout the years. Today, we're very delighted to kick off this year's events with two outstanding economists. Our presenter today, Dr. Bingjing Li, is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Hong Kong. Her work focuses on understanding how openness to trade interacts with development and political economy factors. Bingjing has worked on a wide range of issues related to China, from one-child policy to migration, from the Great Famine to more recently the effect of the US-China trade war on China's economy. She will share with us her latest research, which tries to understand how well-informed US politicians might have been when voting on China's normal trade relations status over 2 decades ago. Our discussant today is Professor James Featherbaum in Boston University. James is also a faculty research fellow at NBER and studies economic history, labor economics, and political economy. He has done very insightful work on inequality, intergenerational mobility, health and mortality, and labor markets in the 19th and 20th century US. So without further ado, let me turn the podium to Professor Bingjing Li.
Thanks, Maggie, for the introduction. So now let me first share my screens and my slides here. Okay, first of all, thank you for having me here. So in the next 40 minutes, and I'm going to present this joint work with Matilda and Francesco. They are both now in Berkeley. And in this particular project, actually, I would like to bring you back 30 years ago, back to the 90s and early 2000s, and see what happened back then. In particular, what was the US-China trade relationship look like back then, and how we end up where we are today. Okay, so the title here is very self-explanatory. We would like to know what kind of information that a politician or the legislators had when they make China-specific trade policies in the 90s and the 2000s. And did they ever expect what was about to come after China's accession to the WTO? So this is the big picture. So in case you don't know what China shock is, basically actually refer to the rapid surge in import competition from China, especially in the periods that China entered into the WTO. So it has been identified as one of the major sources that disrupt the US labor market. There are many seminal papers here showing that, well, the China shock actually induced 17% of the manufacturing job decline in the US. Okay, and over the period of 1999 to 2011, this actually amounted to almost 1 million job loss in the manufacturing sector. And based on some quantitative trade model, you also find that, well, although there is a positive gains trading with China, the distribution of these gains is actually quite uneven across the space in the US. So obviously there are winners and losers. And the impact of the China shock wasn't only contained in the labor market. Okay, it actually got spilled over to different aspects of the US economy. Although it reduced the consumer and the producer prices, it kind of depressed innovation and investment in the US, also lowered the public goods provision, for example. And James has a very exciting paper here showing that, well, the China shock actually affected the trade policy makings in the subsequent decades. So yes, in a nutshell, there is a huge disruptive effect of the China shock. But did we ever expect it coming? And especially did a politician who are supposed to have a better information, okay, ever expect the impact can be this huge, and their information set ever change their voting behaviors, or did the information set ever shape the trade policies specific to China? And this is a bigger picture question we want to tackle in this paper. And to answer these particular questions, we are going to draw on a series of local votes, okay, happening in the US House over the period of 1990 to 2001. So these are repeated votes on the normal trade relationship with China. And in 2000, there is another vote on granting China permanent normal trade relationship. So this is a big deal. Why it is so? And because if China got the normal trade relationship, it can enjoy the MFN tariffs that the US imposed on other fellow members in the WTO, and the average tariff rate is as low as 4 percentage points. However, if the normal trade relationship status was revoked, then China's exporter is going to face a tariff rate on average as high as 31 percentage points. So based on the data in retrospect, we think the politician may have some inklings like what is coming, what was about to come. This is because even in the 1990s, China shock was already partially revealed itself. So for example, the imports coming from China in the US increased by a factor of 4 over the period of 1990 to 2000s. And based on the paper by Autocorrelation and Hansen, they find that the China shock in the 1990s has already caused nearly 0.5 million job loss in the manufacturing sector. And we know also that due to the geographic concentration of the manufacturing activities, the shocks can be highly salient both to the voters as well as the politicians. And so we want to have an answer to this question, and we think the answer to this question could be important because it can have different policy implications. There are two potential possibilities here. The first one is the China shock is not known to the politicians. As a result, they vote in favor of China. And if this is the problem, then it's basically the problem of information frictions. And the corresponding policy recommendation is we should provide more research support for the politicians. The second possible scenario is that, well, the China shock was actually known to the politicians. They actually had knowledge about it. However, they didn't act on the information. Okay, so if this is the case, then obviously this is a political accountability problem. So we are going to differentiate, or we are going to distinguish these two possible scenarios, which scenario receive more supports from the data. Okay, so in this paper, we are going to focus on the information sets, expectations, as well as the preferences of the politicians. However, none of these elements can be directly observed from the data. Okay, so we cannot go and directly ask the politicians, like, what did you know about the future China shock in the 1990s? And most likely we won't get an honest answer. So to actually back out these important fundamental elements for the policy makings, we are going to borrow the methodology proposed by Distin and Morales 2018 paper. And it is so-called a method of moment inequalities. In particular, we are going to tackle several questions. The first goal of this paper is to estimate the weights that the constituency interest, ideology, and other factors had in the congressional votings on the normal trade relationship with China back in the 1990s and the 2000s. And we would also like to know what information these legislators have when they predict the future China shock and when they make their voting decision. And also, will this information set evolve over time? Is it the case that over time, the politicians accumulate more and more knowledge about China? As a result, they're better able to predict the future China shock at the end of the 90s. Or is it the case that the China shock was so abrupt and no one can ever predict it? And so we would like to see how the information evolve over time. Also, we would like to know whether the information vary across individuals and whether different politicians have different information sets. And lastly, we would like to evaluate the value of information by conducting several counterfactual simulations. Basically, we are going to simulate a model and see if we provide politicians with a more complete information set, would their vote on the NTR with China ever changed? So hopefully I will have time to give you the answers to all these questions today. But in case I'm run out of time, so here is the main takeaway of this paper. So in one sentence, we find that politicians back in the 1990s and early 2000s, they already possess quite a bit of information on the future China shock. But the role of constituency interest is pretty limited. So this is the main result of our paper. Okay, our paper is related to the literature on the congressional voting, and James have a very exciting paper on this. So in this literature, people usually focus on three main explanatory variables. For example, the constituency interest, the special interest, for example, the political contribution, and also the ideology. And in contrast, our paper try to focus more on the information and expectations of the politicians. So the political economy literature has highlighted the importance of information. However, in many existing studies, the roles of expectation and information are barely properly modeled. So our paper is trying to fill in this gap. Okay, so here is the roadmap of today's presentation. First, I'm going to provide the empirical framework guiding us how to think about this problem and also how to estimate something that is fundamentally unobservable. Okay, and then I'm going to briefly discuss about this movement inequality approach. Essentially, it's going to help us to estimate the preferences when we cannot observe the information set held by different agents. And these agents are forward-looking. And this is mainly an empirical paper, so I'm going to spend some time on the data and then present the empirical results. And lastly, I'm going to conduct several counterfactual simulations and trying to evaluate the importance of information and the importance of the preference of the politicians in terms to explaining their voting behaviors back in the 1990s. Okay, here is the empirical model. Our baseline model is a very simple spatial voting model. Okay, and the deterministic part of the politician's utility only consists of two components. The first one is the ideological loss. Basically, this is the distance between their own ideology and the policy position of the bills. And the second part is the expected impact of the future China shock and their consequently impact on the electoral support in the future periods. So different periods are denoted by T, and different congressional districts and their representatives are indexed by I. And now I'm going to introduce a little bit more notation. Sorry. Okay, so this is a binary choice, and we use the notation X to denote the policy position of voting in favor of China. And the Q as another parameter is capturing the policy position for a vote that is against China. So importantly, we actually allowed these policy positions to vary over time to capture the idea. For example, in the early 1990s, these bills were introduced into the House as a tool to nudge China to improve their human rights condition. Okay, and this parameter is going to capture this aggregates consideration, the consideration at the aggregate level. And individual ideology is captured by this variable theta. And we model the ideological loss using a very simple quadratic loss function. So the ideological loss is the difference between your own ideology and the policy positions of different votes. Okay, and the future electoral support, or the formulation of the future electoral support is a little bit complicated, but it's actually very simple if you read through it. So I denote the future electoral support by V here, and the deterministic part of the future electoral support is a function of the votes, which is denoted by D, and the future China shock denoted by ST+1. And we are going to impose some linear function on linear functional form for this H function. In particular, in words, we think that a larger China shock is going to lower the electoral support, and more so if the voters observe the politicians vote in favor of China. So this is consistent with the existing evidence, empirical evidence that the China shock has an anti-incumbent effect. It is also consistent with the idea that the voters can observe the policy stances of their representative, and if they're going to reward or punish these incumbents at the ballot box. And based on this formulation, we hypothesize that the gamma 1 is going to be smaller than gamma 2, which is non-positive. Okay, and when they make a decision, the politician is going to make an expectation on their future electoral support based on their votes, as well as the information available to them. So the decision rule here is very simple. Politician is going to vote in favor of China as long as the utility generated voting in favor of China is larger than the utility that voting against China. So what is the utility? After bringing everything together, the utility function is just a combination of the ideological loss and the expected future electoral support. And there is also idiosyncratic preferences here denoted by casus, which is specific to the vote casted. An important parameter in this utility function is actually delta tilde. It actually captures how much the politicians care about their constituency. And only when they care about the constituency, then they will act on the information available to them. Okay, and for the identification purpose, we assume that this casus follows a normal distribution, and on top of that, we assume that the difference of this casus follows a standard normal distribution, meaning that the standard deviation is normalized to be 1. Okay, and so here is the decision rule. They vote in favor of China as long as this vote decision gives them a higher utility. And after bringing everything together, the voting decision can be summarized by this very simple inequality condition. Okay, and to simplify the notation, I actually use introduce the new notations like A, B, and delta to capture the coefficient in front of our important variables. And basically these parameters are the combination of some deep structural parameters in our model. And I would like to bring your attention to one of the important parameters in this decision rule, and that is delta. And it actually is the product of the delta tilde as well as the difference in gamma. So we hypothesize that this delta is non-positive, meaning that if this politician care about their local constituency, and they're less likely to vote in favor of China, the larger the expected China shock is. Okay, so this model is very simple and very intuitive. However, it's not that easy to bring it directly to the data. And why it is so? It is because we as researchers can only observe the realized China shock ex post, but not the politician's expectation ex ante without the knowledge about their information sets. Okay. And as a result, the conventional estimation methods like the probing model, the logic model no longer work in this particular context. And this is where the method of moment inequality approach proposed by this time Morales becomes useful. Basically, to overview their methodology, the main advantage is that it only requires researchers to have a partial knowledge about agents' information sets. So what do I mean here? Essentially, although researchers cannot fully observe I, which is the actual information set owned by the politicians or the agents, sometimes and most often we can observe a subset of I, which is denoted by Z. Okay, for example, many of you met me for the first time and you don't really know who I am. Okay, but I know for sure that you know my gender as well as my ethnicity. Okay, so the gender and ethnicities are two variables in this vector Z. Okay, and this is very convenient because we get around the problem that some variables in these models are fundamentally unobserved. Okay, and now let me briefly talk about the identification assumptions here. So the identification here requires that the expectational errors of these agents is mean independent of the vector Z. Okay, it has a mean 0 conditional on vector Z. So if you stay long enough on this identification assumption, you'll find you are going to find that it's very similar to the exclusion restriction of the instrumentation strategy. Okay, and when this condition is likely to hold, it's very straightforward to show that as long as that is a subset of the actual information set I, and the agents make a rational expectation, and that is the expectational error has a mean 0 conditional to the actual information owned by these politicians, then this identification assumption will automatically will automatically be satisfied. So two conditions here, Z as a subset of actual information I, and the second one is the agents are making rational expectation, meaning that each one can make an error in predicting the future shock. But when you taking the average of these expectational errors across individuals, they're going to cancel out each other and has a mean zero. Okay. All right. And we are going to construct two sets of moment inequalities following the steps in this times and Morales paper. One set is called all space moment inequalities, and the other one is called the review preferences moment inequality. And it can be proved that if the voting model is correctly specified and the identification assumption holds, then we can use these moment inequalities and obtain a set of parameters that can be consistent with the observed voting behaviors of the politicians. And moreover, this set of parameters are going to contain the true parameters. Okay, so we obtained a partial identification. And to account for the sampling errors, so we are going to adopt the estimation method by Andrews and Sauce. And throughout the analysis, I'm going to show you the 95% confidence sets of the parameters. So that's fun. I know that this sounds like a magic, but I'm going to provide you an example to show you how we can pull a rabbit out of the hat. Okay, so here are the simple steps how we construct these odd-space moment inequalities and why this method works when the identification assumptions are valid. Okay, let's start with the decision rule that I just mentioned about. This is just an indicator function. People vote in favor of China if this the left-hand side of this inequality is positive. Okay, and Y here is just a dummy variable, binary variable indicating whether they vote in favor of China or they vote against China. So this is a simple identity equation. And then we can integrate out the idiosyncratic preferences, casus here, and arrive at these moment equations. Okay, but this is not the end, because within these moment equations, we still have two variables that is unobserved. The first one is the expected value of the future China shock. Because we cannot observe I, then we don't know the expectations of these politicians. And the second one is the actual information set held by these politicians. But in our data, we do observe the realized China shock, that's ST+1, as well as the subset Z that we think that the politicians may have the information when they make their voting decisions. Okay, so then what I'm going to do later is trying to replace these unobserved variables here by something that is observable. Okay, so first of all, we are going to use the assumption that the casus here follows the normal distribution, and also agents are making rational expectation. So if these two assumptions hold, then we can invoke the Jensen's inequality, replacing the expected value here by the realized value of the future China shock. Okay, and this step is going to transform these moment equations into a moment inequality condition. That's not the end of it, because in that conditional expectation, you still have something unobserved, and that is I. So in the next step, so we are going to replace I by something observable, that is Z. So if Z is really a subset of I, then we can again invoke the law of iterative expectation, and this inequality sign is going to preserve. So now we are very happy because this becomes something that within this expression, every components are just variables in our data sets. Okay, so this is one of the moment inequalities. And analogously, we can derive another odd space moment inequality. And these moment inequalities are going to provide an upper bound and the lower bound of the parameters of interest. And that is the A, B, and delta. Okay, and we also derive another set of moment inequalities, so-called the review preferences moment inequality. And So we have discussed how to do the estimation, and you based on these moment inequalities, and how to estimate the delta, which is the main parameters of interest. And now we want to move forward and tackle our second question. What did the politicians know when they make the voting decision? And to answer this question, we are going to introduce some specification test to test whether Z is indeed a subset of I. So what is the idea here? I won't go into the technical details, but the intuition here is very simple. So suppose Z is not really a subset of I, then some of the derivations that I just mentioned about will collapse. Okay, and some of the specified moment inequalities are just invalid. So it's likely that we won't be able to find any parameters that will be consistent with the data. And put in other words, the confidence set is likely to be empty. Okay, so the statistical test following this logic is so-called test BP in the Budnik's paper. And formally, we are going to conduct a statistical test to see whether Z is a subset of I, and we are going to reject this hypothesis at a 5% level if the 95% confidence interval, confidence set is an empty set. Okay, and for completeness, we are also going to report the test RC and test RS recommended by this paper. Okay, and then throughout the analysis, we are going to test 3 specifications. Let's start from the simplest case. So in this case, we are going to specify the Z so that it only contains 2 factors. One is the local share of the manufacturing. Basically, this is a local manufacturing employment share. And the other one is the politicians' own ideology. People know their ideology, and it is quite natural to assume that as a representative of a district, these people should know the size or the importance of the manufacturing sector. And this specification is named minimal information. And then we are going to move up the ladder and write down another specification, so-called baseline information. And in this case, we assume that in addition to this minimal information, the politicians can also observe the past China shock. And I'm going to be more specific, like with China shock later on. Okay, and which requires them to have more knowledge. Okay. And lastly, we consider an extreme case, and that is perfect foresight. So in this case, the politicians also know all other remaining factors in predicting the future shock that are orthogonal to the elements in the baseline information. Or put in other words, as long as the politicians have information on all these factors, and they can they can have some exact prediction on the future China shock. Okay, and now let's briefly talk about the data we have. So with the China shock, we are not doing anything like innovative in this part of the paper. We just borrow the measure from the literature. So the China shock is actually the interaction between the local industry compositions with the industry-specific changes in the import penetration from China. And if you take a look at this body style measure, you know that a district is going to have a larger exposure to the future China shock if it specializes in the industries that saw a faster growth of imports from China. Okay, and also following the literature, we are going to use the imports from China by 8 other high-income countries. And this is for the purpose of isolating the surge in China's supply capacities from other US domestic demand factors. And this is the future China shock, and the past China shock is defined analogously, where we actually lag all the variables by 5 years. And both the future China shock and the past China shocks are defined over the 5-year window. Okay, for example, if we focus on the vote happened in 1995, then the future China shock is something happened between 1995 to 2000, and the past China shock is something happened between 1990 to 1995. Okay, and the other data are from the very standard sources. For example, the trade data comes from the UN Comtrade, and domestic absorption data comes from the NBRCS database, and the the industry employment data comes from the county business patterns. And okay, and what about the information on the voting outcomes? This data comes from the vote view. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to look at a series of bills that that happen repeatedly in the U.S. Congress. And also, we are also going to introduce a bill that conditionally grants China permanent normal trade relationship in 2000s. So in total, we actually have like 13 bills in our data sets. And here is the snapshot of our data. The red line here shows you the cross-district average of the future China shock. And the blue lines here shows you the cross-district average of the past China shock. So based on these two trends, you know that we can observe that the China shocks actually move more in tandem in the earlier periods. The correlation of the trends becomes weaker in the later periods. Actually suggesting that, or maybe it becomes more and more difficult to predict the China shock if it's just based on this time series data. Okay, and the gray bar here shows you the share of votes that are in favor of China. In the periods that immediately follow the Tiananmen Square events, the share of votes are all below 50%. But there is a structural break in 1993 when Bill Clinton took the office. So for the consideration that the fellow partisans may have strong incentives to pass their president's policy agenda, so in the following analysis, sometimes they're going to cut the data into different sample periods, depending on the presidential administrations. And lastly, we are going to collect other informations like the politician's ideology, their tenure, as well as their winning margins in the House election. Okay, finally, we arrive at the empirical results. Let's start from the full sample period, that is 1990 to 2001, where we put all the votes together into the estimation. So let's start from panel A, where we estimate this specification with minimal information. So the key parameter of interest here is actually delta. Okay, and in panel B, we test the specification with baseline information. So on top of the share of manufacturing and the individual's ideology, they also know about the past China shock. So we find that the confidence interval of delta, of the confidence set of delta, does not contain zero, meaning that these politicians, they care about their constituency. When the China shock or the expected China shock increases, they are less likely to vote in favor of China. And lastly, in panel C, we test the specification of perfect foresight, and we can easily reject that the politicians have perfect foresight here. And then we try to see whether the information sets and the preferences of the politicians change over time by looking at the results in different periods. So in 1997 to 2001, the basic patterns are very similar to the results I just mentioned about. We can easily reject that delta equals zero, people care about their constituency interests, and we can also easily reject that these politicians have perfect foresight on the future China shock. And it's also the case over the periods of 1993 to 1996. What is interesting is what happened in the earliest period, and that's 1990 to 1992. So in this case, although we still see that people care about their constituency interests, but we can no longer reject the specification that the politicians have perfect foresight, indicating that in the earlier period, they may have a more complete information on what is coming in the next 5 years. Okay, so we find the statistical significance. What about the economic magnitude of this coefficient or these estimates? So to answer this question, we are going to conduct a very simple back of the envelope calculation. Basically, we are going to move a politician with an average ideology from the 25th percentile of the distribution of expected future China shock to the 75th percentile, and to see how the likelihood of voting in favor of China is going to change. And based on this exercise, we find that the effect is actually quite minimal. So we find that at most, the likelihood of voting in favor of China is going to decline by around 7 percentage points. Okay, and this is actually the lower bound of our estimates. And then let's compare this magnitude with the magnitude implied by another parameters A, and that is the weight on the ideology. Similarly, we are going to move individuals from the 25th percentile of the ideology to the 75th percentile. We find that this interquartile increase in ideology can have can induce a large change in their voting behavior, especially in the latest periods as well as in the earliest period. For example, over the period of 1997 to 2001, an interquartile increase in the ideology can at least increase the vote share in favor of China by around 13 percentage points. Okay. Then we are going to ask another question. So why in the earlier periods, the people appears to have more information about the future China shock? And this figure actually gives us some suggestive evidence. Here we actually estimate the autocorrelation of the growth in imports from China at the industry level. And you can see that in the earlier year, the autocorrelations are higher. As a result, if you just based on the time series data, then you can do a better prediction on the or do a better forecasting on the future China shock. Okay, and here are some results on the heterogeneity analysis. Basically, we are going to estimate the model by the characteristics of these politicians. And for the time's sake, I just focus on the specification with the baseline information over the whole period. So there are several interesting results to highlight. For example, we find that the Republicans don't have the baseline information. Okay, well, the weight on the constituency interest is higher for the Democrats, if you still remember the magnitude of our previous result, which pull all the politicians together. Okay, and also we find that the politicians who face a tighter electoral competition, the delta is larger, meaning that these people, when they face like more electoral pressure, they're going to impose a larger weight on the constituency interest. And lastly, we don't find any discernible differences between the estimates among the individuals with different experiences based on tenure and also based on the district's exposure to the Japan shock happening in the 70s and 80s. So meaning that the experiences here may play the relative minor role in explaining their different behaviors. And I think it may be helpful to corroborate our results using some data from other sources and that are less dependent on the model as well. So to this end, we actually use the data from the congressional speech, okay, and see whether the politicians in the districts facing a high exposure to China in the period 2001 to 2006 differentially mention more about the issues related to China trade issue or the China labor issues. Okay, so we allowed these effects to be different across different parties and also to be different across different sections in the Congress. So it's, I think this contrast between the Democrats and the Republicans are particularly interesting, at least to me. So first of all, we find that the Democrats started to mention more about China even before China's entry into the WTO, and that is well before this shock is fully realized. Okay, and after China's entry into the WTO and when this shock gradually revealed itself, we find that both parties start mentioning more about China, especially for the agents in the region that have faced a larger exposure. But the Republicans or the Democrats actually mention more relatively to the Republicans. So this pattern actually echoes our previous finding. First of all, it appears to be the case that the Democrats have more information about the future China shock. That's why they mentioned about it earlier. And secondly, the weight on the constituency interest is higher for the Democrats as well. Okay, so this is our main empirical results. And then we are going to conduct several counterfactual simulations to evaluate the importance of the information. And in the first scenario, in the first set of counterfactual simulation, we are going to improve the information of the politician, increasing their information from the baseline level to the case with the complete information. And we simulate the counterfactual change in the share of votes in favor of China. So this is the share expressed as a percentage points. Okay, so you can see that this effect is actually minimal. Improving their information actually had little effects on their voting behaviors. So why it is so? It actually has something to do with some features in this particular setting. The first one is something I have already shown you, and that is the constituency interest in our model actually played a relatively limited role. So the delta has a small economic magnitude. And the second reason is that the variation of the expectational error is moderate as well. Meaning that although these politicians have no perfect information about China, but they already possess quite a bit of information. So their prediction is relatively precise, and the error is that the dispersion of the error is relatively small. So this is the one of the suggestive evidence. Sorry, I have some difficulty changing the slides. So here we just run a very simple OLS regression, regressing the future China shock on the two main explanatory variables, the past China shock as well as the local manufacturing share. And the R squared here captures the variation of the future China shock that can be explained by these two variables alone. Okay, and it turns out the R squareds are all above 50%, and it's even larger in the earlier periods. Okay, so that's why we say that, well, the variation of the expectational error could be very small, because as long as you own the knowledge of these two variables, you can make a relatively precise prediction on the future China shock. Or put in another word, providing more information has a very little value added for these people when they make the voting decision. Okay, so information has a relatively small role. So what about their preference? To understand the role of the delta in our model, in the second set of counterfactual simulation, so we are going to heighten the role of constituency interest. Essentially, we are going to reset the delta to the maximum plausible values across our estimates. For example, in panel B, we are going to assign the preference of the Democrats to every politician in our data. Okay, and in panel C, we are going to assign the preference of the people facing tight competition to every politician in our data. And we find that if this is the case, like the constituency interest is heightened in the model, then the aggregate voting outcome can be altered in some periods. For example, in 1997 to 2001, the share of votes in favor of China is going to be most likely lower than 30 percentage points. Okay, meaning that most likely China won't be able to get a normal trade relationship in this period. And similarly, over 1993 to 1996, if the people have the delta equal with a much larger value, then the bill can be easily rejected in the Congress. Okay, so this is actually all the main findings of our paper. So let me conclude here. Let's recircle back to our questions, like whether the politician knew about the China shock, about the future China shock, and whether the information shaped their voting behaviors. The answer to these questions actually are twofold. First of all, although they don't have perfect foresight of the future China shock, the politician back then had quite a bit of information in predicting this future shock. However, the role of constituency interest is relatively limited. And that's part of the reason why China basically can get the NTR status renewed every year. And also another finding we have is, well, it appears to be that future China shock over time becomes more and more difficult to predict because the productivity growth, especially in the later periods, becomes more abrupt and more difficult to predict. I hope I didn't run out of time, Maggie.
No, you're perfectly on time, Bingjing. So
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. It's a lot of information to absorb, but let me now turn the mic to James, who will be discussing Bingjing's work and the broader literature.
Yes, thanks, Maggie, so much. And so thank you for the invite. Thank you, Bingjing, for presenting that paper so nicely. I'm excited to talk about it. Let me put this up on the screen. I'll try to do just a really quick recap of the paper, although we just saw it, so hopefully everyone was paying attention. I think we know sort of coming into this that the China shock has had really widespread and deep effects on the American economy. And then it turns out effects on politics, effects on demographic society, sort of everything. The question that Bingjing and her co-authors asked in this paper is, did the members of Congress who voted for or against trade normalization, and yes, you saw they did it repeatedly year after year. What were they thinking? Did they expect, anything that we eventually see that happened? So we could ask, like, was it a surprise, or did they sort of anticipate and they kind of just didn't care about the effects? And the findings seem to be that at least in the 1990s, the economic effects were likely foreseen, like they seem to have some level of foresight. Later effects, a little fuzzier, whether they were super predictable. But overall, I think the most intriguing, maybe surprising punchline of this, given how much sort of popular and academic interest there's been in the China shock, how much ink has been spilled, and how many papers have been written, how many op-eds, how many conferences. It seems like the MCs, even if they had accurate expectations, they seem to push sort of lower weight on the effects on their constituents, which I think is a really sort of intriguing thing, and I'll come back to that. So as the paper sort of outlines, the effects of the China shock have been large. It's spawned this really large literature, and I just want to sort of emphasize, there's been the original kind of economics papers, how many people lost their jobs, effects on employment rates. There's been a huge wide swath of other research, and I want to just sort of, for those of you who are I guess non-academics or at least not immersed in this literature, the sheer number of papers that have sort of studied different aspects, different effects of the China shock are quite overwhelming when I try to start putting this together. And I'll share with you just a few of the quick highlights. And so if you're interested in any of these outcomes in particular, you can sort of dig deeper. And then I'll hopefully come back to make a relevant point once we've talked a bunch of different outcomes. There's also a really substantial body of work on the so-called China shock, basically elsewhere. Other trade partners, so from Europe to the developing world. There's also effects on the sort of the rise of China-US trade on China. I know, and Bingjing has some work herself on that. I'm mostly going to focus, I think, or entirely focus on like the US side, just to kind of restrict the parameter space, if you will. So we've seen people move So, this paper from Greenland and co-authors, as Bingjing mentioned, like basically people flee the China shock in these US counties that have the biggest effects, with the biggest migration being among the young and the least educated. We also see effects on marriage. So one thing that's really interesting about the China shock is that it's gender biased. And it's gender biased in a very particular way. So I guess maybe we're getting more familiar with this. The COVID shock, we think, was also quite gender biased, although in the opposite direction. The shock from Chinese trade in the US, at least, had the effect of sort of impacting men much more negative for men than women. It makes sense when you think about who is employed in a lot of these manufacturing jobs that were hit. And so David Otter and Dorn and Hansen, the sort of the original China shock authors, have this paper that shows that marriage and fertility both fall, as well as something called male idleness, which is basically you're not in the labor market, don't have not in school, just kind of doing nothing. Those things rise with the onset. There's also effects on local public goods. So in the US, much of so like I said, the economic effects flow into local government finances. We know these effects about lower labor demand, lower incomes, housing prices, and business activity falls. Well, there's sort of a problem when most local governments are going to be funded primarily by property taxes and sales taxes. This shock is going to be really bad if to government revenue. And so it turns out places cut down on their public spending. There's also actually sort of a positive educational effect, where we see, imagine you're in school at this time, you're in high school, you're deciding whether to drop out of school and get a job or continue getting education. To the extent that the China shock was really bad for especially the labor market outcomes of people with less education, you can imagine that pushes people to stay in school a little bit longer. There's a wide literature on health. I'm only going to highlight a few of the most interesting papers. Most interesting, fighting words. A few papers that I find interesting. So, we see effects on substance abuse, especially opioids, increases in sort of people complaining of chronic pain or backaches and chest pain. Ultimately, more hospitalizations due to heart problems in these counties that are most exposed to the import competition. The Ada and Fawaz argue actually this is mostly in the places where manufacturing jobs are also sort of like routine oriented, which is to say that those are also the places that are at risk of like automation and technology shocks. There's also this is a very depressing result, an increase in sort of the deaths of despair, the overdoses, suicides in the counties that are most exposed to import competition, and big negative mental health effects. Sort of 3 more bad mental health days on average for the average person, which is a quite substantial effect. And then there's some effects on crime. Property crime especially increases in the counties and the commuting zones that are most affected by the China shock. Thankfully, public policy ameliorates this a little bit. It turns out if you have a more generous unemployment insurance package, like you can sort of cut back on some of the crime effects. But as we just learned a minute ago, there's also these negative local government effects. And so maybe the shock is both increasing crime and sort of reducing government responses. In terms of, I was actually expecting there to be a pollution effect because we have a litany of things that sort of went wrong. It seems that there's actually not a big trade-driven pollution effect in the US at least, although I know Bingjing has a paper on the flip side of this, on the pollution effects within China. And then there's one last sort of like, not last, there's obviously probably 1,000 other papers that I have mentioned here. One other one I go to is this question about innovation. And so as this is going to come from another one of David Otter and Dorn and Hansen's papers, where the question is basically as import competition heats up, are these firms forced to cut back on R&D and innovation and development? The time series, which I've improperly cropped, and so you can't quite tell what these lines are, but the green line is the increase in Chinese imports to the US. It doesn't totally suggest an obvious relationship, but I guess that's why you can't ever really trust a pure time series. And so when they look across industries, Dorn and Hansen, now they've added 2 co-authors, they're going to argue that rising import exposure is going to reduce sales, reduce profitability, and then ultimately cut back on R&D, and so less innovation. Okay, so that's like a huge set of, let's call them downstream consequences of increased import competition from China, or more succinctly, of the China shock. I think that where it is to come back to this paper, I guess the question for me is, did the U.S. politicians expect the China shock? And we get an answer to that sort of on the, I think, mostly on the labor market side. Like, did they kind of anticipate the unemployment effects or the wage effects? Or did they anticipate whether they were representing a district that had a lot of people who might be affected by import competition? But I think a deeper sort of piece of this is like, well, how much foresight did they have? How far downstream could politicians predict? Like, if you're a politician who really cares about, social questions, so like you really care about the marriage rate, or you really care about birth rates, or unwed mothers having kids, could you have predicted that the China shock would have led to stuff like that? And then, so maybe those things are in your utility function as a politician, but maybe you cared less about the factory workers who lost their jobs, or it's about innovation or crime, or who knows, like any of these deeper downstream outcomes. And I guess, and maybe the answer is, they could have foreseen this, or they couldn't have, and so there's too much uncertainty, they would have figured it out. But I guess thinking about how, when we say politicians did expect the China shock, what exactly are we saying about what they're expecting? How far downstream are they going? The other piece that I think is worth puzzling over altogether are these political effects. So again, Otto, Dorn, and Hansen have this paper. There's more polarization, there's more conservatism in the districts that get hit most by the shock. Vote shares for Trump in 2016 are higher. I haven't seen the parallel 2020 paper, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was still true. This is also consistent with a lot of international evidence on import competition, and particularly like sort of a rightward turn in politics. And so I guess that brings us back to this question of like, well, what do voters care about if the politicians don't seem to care about their voters so much? Is this because voters don't care about trade policy, or is it because voters don't know about trade policy, or something happening? And that's where I think the literature of the sort of the more political effects of the China shock could be relevant. So as Bingjing mentioned, I have this paper with Andy Hall, which apparently I've forgotten now what year it was. I think Bingjing was right, it was 2015, not 2016, where we see that politicians seem to act like they think that their voters care about trade. They're sort of the guys who are most exposed to the China shock. They are changing their votes in Congress, not necessarily on votes about Chinese trade, but votes about future free trade. They sort of move more protectionist, and that's especially true among Republicans. And sort of interestingly, we see this within the same member of Congress. It's not that these members get voted out by someone who's more protectionist. It's they sort of change their position. And there's this really nice model. I say nice model because I couldn't entirely understand it, so I assume it's really nice. Barton Lee, who was a PhD student at I think New South Wales, where basically politicians think that voters care so much about trade that they start pretending that they also care about trade. And so again, there's this idea at least that constituents should care. But that's not totally obvious. Like, we think there's an effect of the trade shock on voters, but it's really hard to disentangle whether it's about the trade itself, or about the downstream economic shocks, or about any of those other downstream effects. And so, I'll just leave us with this one last sort of bit of literature. It seems like the most China trade exposed people, they basically become more right-wing, more conservative, a bunch of different dimensions, things that seem to have very little to do with trade. And so there's this puzzle, again, if politicians could anticipate this, like, are they happy with these outcomes or not? And are they sort of choosing their Chinese trade policy, in line with what they think the voters want, or what they think this will do to their voters? Or is there just so much uncertainty downstream that it's hard for them to sort of figure it out? And so anyways, just to summarize, is there something of attention, like voters seem to be moved by trade shocks, and the politicians seem to be able to predict the effects, and they seem to want to get reelected. So why do they put so little weight on the effects? And then my last sort of big question, which maybe is sort of beyond the scope of what we want to talk about here, is China or trade, it's special. Like, would we see this on a bunch of other issue dimensions? Like, has Bingjing sort of presented us with a new toolkit to think about, like, figuring out how politicians care or don't care about their voters on a wide range of issues? And would we expect, like, the sort of the results here to generalize to trade with other countries, or to generalize even more generally to sort of other issues where we see maybe a tension between what politicians do and what we think their voters might care about? So I'll be quiet there now and turn it back over to I guess Maggie to do some Q&A.
Thanks, James. Thanks for the really comprehensive review of the literature. In fact, I'm going to save a copy of your presentation and make sure to circulate with my students who are interested in joining this fast-growing large literature. So Bingjing, maybe you want to respond first to James' discussions before I turn to the Q&As from the audience, the questions from the audience?
Yes, for sure. Thanks, James, for this excellent discussion. I would like to have the slides as well. Actually, your literature review is more complete than what is there in our paper. Yes, I think one of the key issues that we kept thinking about is, in the paper we just said, well, these politicians don't care, right? But there is as James kind of mentioned, that there is a possibility why they didn't care is because they actually kind of make a mistake when predicting, like, what is the downstream effects. So another scenario that we can come out about is if they know the size of the China shock, but they somehow kind of underestimate the labor market impacts of the China shock back in the 1990s. So in this case, this one is one of the explanations why the estimate of delta is pretty low in our base, at least in the framework, in our framework. Okay, so actually I don't have like a perfect strategy to disentangle this two possibilities. The first one is they cannot predict the downstream effect. The second one is they genuinely don't care. Okay, so that's why I went too fast. But in the paper, so we kind of do the heterogeneity analysis. Like we kind of divide the districts into the region which had a larger exposure to the Japan shock. Okay, in the 80s. And so the idea is, well, if these regions had already experienced something very disruptive, okay, they should have like a better experience of what the labor market impact is, what the downstream impact is. It's a bit surprising to me that we don't really see that there is any differences in the delta there. Okay, so I know this is not a complete, perfect evidence saying that, oh, they have a perfect information on the labor impacts, labor market impact of the China shock. But we take it as some subjective evidence and saying that, oh, maybe it's their genuine preference. Okay, they didn't care back in the 1990s. And is any special about the China shock? I don't really think so. And I do think there is something special in the 1990s, maybe. You know, the US is experiencing economic boom in the 1990s, and potentially it is one of the reasons they think, the politicians think that they can weather through the China shock in the future if China get into the WTO. But this is something very interesting that we probably will leave it for the future research. Thanks.
Great. Now let's turn to the audience. And I see questions already started coming in. And so I think there are at least two other alternative explanations that people might be thinking. One is the functions, the objective functions of the politicians, right? You stress two categories, ideologies and expectations about the China shock. And James mentioned some other downstream consequences that might enter or not enter the objective functions of politicians. Now, our in-house experts, Barbara Stallings, Professor Stallings, and Mike Moore, have other possible variables in the politicians' functions, such as lobbying, right? The interest groups' influence over the policy making, right? Which can come from a variety of groups, the industry groups and from the US and probably possibly China as well. And Mike mentioned, what about the potential exports to China, right? Because the China shock is just one side, it's just focusing on the import side of the relationship. What about the export opportunities, the offshoring opportunities of multinationals who might actually take advantage of the more stable economic relations and offshore activities abroad and enjoying a higher profit as a result? What about the institutional reforms that the politicians might foresee or hope to see after the the NTR status and entry into WTO? And what about the price benefits to the US consumers, right? So this is something that I would add to the China shock literature. There's Rob Finster's work and Shang Jingwei's work on the price effects of more imports from China. So maybe you can comment on that, the other variables in the politicians' objective functions before I get to the other questions.
Right. Yes, we do acknowledge that there are many, many other factors simultaneously affecting the policy decision makings. Like in a long session of robustness track in the paper, we try to account for as much as these other considerations possible. For example, lobbying, we do collect the data on the lobbying expenditure, on the political contributions from different parties, like different interest groups. And you throw it into the estimation model. And yes, as expected, if the politician receive more political contribution from the business, and we see that they are less likely to vote, they're more likely to vote in favor of China. On the other hand, if they receive more contribution from the labor union, then they're less likely to vote in favor of China. But we are very cautious here to interpret those coefficients to capture any causal effect, because there is a big debate in the political economy literature. What is the direction, right? And sometimes the money just follow the policies, okay, instead of influencing the policies. So we take it as a robustness track instead of putting those variables into our baseline estimation, because we don't have a good instrument for that variable. Yeah, for asphalt, indeed, there's a lot of conjecture, like why China passed this NTR bill so easily in the 1990s. One possibility is, well, these multinational firms, okay, they lobby in favor of it, and for the purpose of exporting, for the purpose of entering into the China's market. So, but on the other hand, in the data, we also observe that the import from China is actually an order of magnitude larger than the export to China. Okay, that's why there's a trade imbalance, and through the lens of the ADH model is the trade imbalance that causes all this problem. Okay, so following the same or in the same spirit, basically we can construct another measure based on the net export, meaning that we subtract the imports by the exports, and this could potentially capture the net effect, the cost versus the benefits. And again, we put into our model and try to re-estimate everything again, and the conclusion is very similar. And price effect, Maggie, I totally agree. There are several, 2 papers recently showing that, oh, well, trading with China lower the consumer prices as well as the producer prices. Unfortunately, I don't have a good price data at the industry level. But I actually try to construct this consumption shifters in Archaeologists and adults paper. Okay, it's also the body style instruments, and however that measure is highly correlated with the ADH import shock. So I cannot put the 2 variables together into the same estimation. But in case you have any idea how to get a high quality price data, do let me know.
Great. Now let's switch the question to the other side, which is how the voters view or care about their politicians' stance, right? So this question comes from one of our PhD students, Jeffrey. Jeffrey is asking, it seems like the politicians believe the voters care about trade, so they try to vote, in line with the voters' or the perceived voters believe, right? But do voters really care about the politicians' trade policy stance that much? Or maybe it's the other stance, right, on different issues, such as, tax, such as the Second Amendment, other things that that actually draw the voters. Could that play a role in your result?
Yeah, here we didn't actually, because this paper focused on the behavior of politicians, so we kind of sideline the responses of the voters. And part of the reason is that there are already many papers trying to see what is the impact of import competitions on different voting outcomes, like turnouts, like the vote shares going to the Republicans and going to Republican parties and the Democratic parties. So in some, there are a lot of evidence showing that the China shock has an anti-incumbent effect. Okay, so meaning that the incumbent is more likely to be voted out of the office when the districts receive a larger China shock. So this is already an indirect evidence showing people that, well, the voters care because some of them lost their jobs. And also I mentioned in the presentation at the very beginning, the China shock has one particular feature, and that is highly geographically concentrated. So it's very salient to the voters. They lose job, the whole factory got shut down. And James also had very interesting papers showing that because of the China shock, then the subsequent voting behavior of the legislators in the US House changed as well. And one of the motivation of their changing behavior is because the voter cares. Okay, so to respond to this question, in our paper, we didn't directly go and test how the voters are voting changes, how their opinions change, but there are already many studies giving us some confidence that voters care as well.
Thanks, Bingjing. So now another question, which is, I think, the big question at the end of the day is that, could we draw any implications of the findings today for the current state of US-China relations, right? So this question comes from Eric. Would the findings suggest that the current negative view of China in the US Congress is largely based on ideology and not going to respond to changes in policies?
Well,
or do you have more optimism?
I think this is a really big question. So anything I said is a kind of a speculation. Okay, so basically, I think the consensus in academia is, well, the China shock occurred in the 1990s and in the 2000s before the financial crisis. And then my other paper shows that, well, China actually experienced an export slowdown after the financial crisis. For example, over the period of 2014 to 2016, the growth rate of China's export were actually negative. Okay, there is an export slowdown. So a natural question is why the US government attacked China when China's export is slowing down in this particular period. And also there is another paper by Nick Broom showing that, well, if we extend the analysis after 2010 and run the same regression as the ADH paper, then you no longer see the increase in imports from China affects the labor market outcomes in the US. So basically what we did is we try to understand the politicians' behavior like 10 decades ago. So our paper potentially cannot shed a lot of lights on what's going on nowadays. And there are other kind of a discussion like this is not really a trade war. Instead, this is a technology war, right? And technology war for going beyond the manufacturing sector. And I think the main focus of our paper, of course, I have other co-authors who work on the political economy. They more like, they have the preference like, oh, we propose a methodology trying to estimate the politicians' preferences and their expectations. And hopefully these two kits can be applied to other scenarios as well. Mm-hmm.
Great. If I may jump in here, I want to maybe just selfishly interject my own research on this is that we recently ran rounds of surveys to the public, not to the politicians, and with David too, with your co-author.
Right.
And this might be related to Eric's question, which is why I'm jumping in here, not just really to promote my work, though I would love to, but it's that we try to provide narratives about the cost of globalization, including imports from China, and the benefits of globalization, by importing from China. And we do that to random groups of people in the public, okay? And we have a control group. And surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly to some people, is that neither group, neither treaty group, okay, doesn't matter what we told them, the benefits or the costs, they responded the same way compared to the control group. Both treatment groups wanted more protectionist trade policies, and in particular, import limits on China. So I'm not sure, it's the economic consequences or the economic benefits people are thinking about when they express their views or preferences for trade policies. So I agree, with you and James and some of the, the questions that the people in the audience, that it might be other factors as well they are thinking about, right? It could be the downstream consequences. It could be their priors. It could be, the ideologies, some of the other considerations playing a role in their objective functions, including in the public, among the public. So don't know if the audience would have more questions, but this is James. Yeah, James, do you wanna jump in to see if you have more follow-up questions, or you?
Yeah. So no, the one thing I wanted to interject about sort of what we were just talking about was this question of like, oh, if it's not about policy, or if it's not about the effects of trade, is it all about ideology? And then like, therefore, does policy not matter? And I guess I would just caution, we don't have any research necessarily to say this, but like ideology itself is not a fixed item. Like politician ideology can change, and even it can change within politician. It can change certainly when you replace politicians. And so to the extent that like, it may be that trade policy in particular isn't gonna, like, Chinese trade policy or Chinese industrial policy isn't gonna be the policy lever that shifts because like sort of through the trade shock stuff. But it certainly, it could still have influence on ideology, which I guess is an open question. Like if we think that Chinese anti-China sentiment in Congress is a function of, well, it's probably a function of something. And then the question is like, it's almost certainly not an unchanging function of policy more broadly. And so obviously this is pretty vague, but like, that might be a place where we could potentially unpack and try to understand what are the policies that then shift ideology, even if they're not coming through like district level trade effects.
Yes, I think one of the challenges here is our measure on the ideology. So we just adopted like a very conventional measure, like a DW ideology index, and that was adopted quite a lot by the political scientists. And I agree with James, like this is like a very broad measure, and I don't know how well it can capture the changing ideology specific to trade. And if any one of you know that if there is a better measure on that dimension, it would be great. Yeah. Right, because that ideology measure basically capture how conservative and how liberal the politician is, and it remains a black box, like what is the role of the trade there in shaping the ideology, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with James that we need to take a dynamic view about ideology and their policy stance. People change sometimes dramatically.
Right, and I think one of the analysis might help with that is you actually group all these divide samples into shorter periods. And then I think the assumption that the ideology within an individual is fixed in that short sample period is more reasonable.
Yeah.
Right, and that exercise might help, but for the longer period, then I don't have a good answer, like whether the ideology specific to trade policy is fixed or not.
Excellent. Excellent. So let me just wrap up by thanking Bingjing and James for really enlightening talks on this very important issue. This really helps us think about how one of the most important historical decisions concerning US-China trade relations has been made. And there are open questions, and I think we would love to see more research in this direction. And now, for those of you who have not gotten enough about the China political economy, I would like to make announcements about another event this afternoon, in fact, at 12:30. This time about the Chinese politics, not the US politics. It's by Elliott School's own renowned China expert, Professor David Shangbao, who will discuss his new book, China's Leaders from Mao to Now. And I will put the link of the event in the chat, or maybe Kyle can do that for everybody on the call. So yeah, be on the lookout for that event. And then our next installment of the series will be a talk by Professor Edwin Lai from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology on November 5th. Edwin will launch his new book on China's attempt to internationalize the renminbi, and we'll get to hear a lot about the monetary policy and the potential influence overseas. So I want to thank everybody again for your participation today, and I hope you will stay tuned for more of our events. Thank you, Bingjing and James, again.